hearted. But those whispers about shadows that moved on their own, footsteps echoing in empty hallways, and mannequins seeming to breathe, he never believed any of it. Until one fateful night, when he was left alone to close them all. By the end of that shift, he wouldn't just believe the stories. He would become one. As the final announcements played over the PA system, their cheerful tone felt out of place, almost mocking, against the unnerving quiet that settled over the building. The usual hum of the mall, the distant chatter, the shuffle of shoes, the rhythmic ding of cash registers, had been replaced by a heavy stillness, as though the air itself were holding its breath. The distant clatter of a closing gate echoed faintly, but apart from that, it was just him and the lifeless halls. Or so he thought. Before we unravel this chilling tale, remember, the darkness hides many things. Hit the like button, subscribe to Sinister Stories, and share this video with anyone brave enough to venture into the unknown. Ready? Let's step into the shadows together. Liverpool shopping centre was a beacon of life during the day, filled with laughter, chatter, and the constant hum of commerce. But as the clock crept towards midnight, its vibrant energy transformed into an unsettling void. The fluorescent lights, so bright and inviting during business hours, now seemed harsh, casting long, distorted shadows that stretched and twisted along the deserted corridors. The once friendly mannequins in the store windows appeared sinister, their blank faces catching the dim light in ways that made them seem alive, watching, waiting. The air felt thick, almost oppressive, as if the building itself were aware of the intruder walking through its empty halls. Every sound, no matter how small, seemed amplified. The faint hum of an old air vent, the distant click of a cooling escalator, the soft squeak of the protagonist's boots on the polished floor. But underneath it all was a deeper silence, a silence that felt unnatural, as though it had swallowed the usual sounds and left only an echo of something unseen. The fitting rooms, where the story would later spiral into terror, were tucked into a corner of the department store, shrouded in shadow. This area had always felt slightly off, even during the day. Customers joked about the mirrors feeling too reflective, as if they stared back just a little too intently. Now, under the dim emergency lights, the fitting rooms looked like gaping mouths, waiting for someone to step inside. The faint hum of the security cameras did little to break the tension. Instead, it served as a constant reminder that every corner of the mall could be watching. The protagonist, let's call him Mark, couldn't shake the feeling of being observed. It wasn't paranoia, it was something primal, a sixth sense screaming that he wasn't alone. As he walked through the empty mall, performing his final checks, his flashlight flickered. A malfunction, surely. But in the brief moments of darkness, he could swear he saw movement at the edge of his vision. Small, fleeting shadows darting across the aisles, too quick and too silent to be human. Arriving at the fitting rooms, Mark paused. The chill in the air was stronger here, biting through his uniform and settling deep in his bones. The air carried a faint metallic tang, like rust or old blood, though he couldn't find its source. The fitting room mirrors reflected the dim light in strange ways, almost as if the reflections lagged behind his movements. It was a detail he might have brushed off as fatigue on any other night, but tonight, every oddity felt significant, like pieces of a puzzle he didn't want to solve. The mall seemed alive, its long, empty corridors like veins, the occasional groan of metal like a low, inhuman moan. The walls themselves seemed to pulse with an invisible energy. Mark tightened his grip on his flashlight, telling himself it was just another night. But deep down, he knew the mall wasn't just empty, it was waiting. As Mark sat in the security office, the glow of the monitor screens casting a cold, pale light across his face, he began his usual routine of checking the cameras. Each corner of the mall was eerily still, the once bustling corridors now frozen in time. But it was in that quiet monotony that the first crack appeared in the fragile fabric of his reality. On one of the screens, he noticed her, a girl standing motionless outside the fitting rooms, her back turned to the camera. She clutched a crimson blouse in her hand, the vibrant color almost too vivid against the muted tones of the night. Mark leaned closer to the screen. Something about her struck him as odd. Her stillness was unnatural, as if she were not just standing but waiting. Her hair fell in dark, lifeless strands over her shoulders, and her posture was rigid, too deliberate for someone casually browsing. He watched as she turned slowly, and for a brief moment, her face came into view. The girl's eyes weren't simply looking, they were piercing, as if they could see through the camera, through the screen, and directly into him. Then she moved, gliding almost unnaturally toward the fitting rooms. Mark rewound the footage, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't place why, but something about her movements was wrong. There was no sound accompanying her steps, no faint creak of the floor, no rustle of clothing. It was as if she were an image superimposed on the scene, a fragment of something that didn't belong. Minutes passed, and the girl didn't reappear. Mark fast-forwarded through the footage, but she remained inside the fitting room, never emerging. He glanced nervously at the time, nearly midnight. He hadn't seen any other customers on the cameras in hours, and by now, the mall should have been empty. A soft, almost imperceptible sound broke his concentration, a faint tapping, like fingernails against glass. Mark froze, scanning the room, his pulse quickening. The sound came again, louder this time, unmistakably coming from the monitors. On the screen, the image of the fitting rooms remained unchanged, but now, faintly, he could see movement in the mirror inside the girl's stall. It was subtle at first, like a shadow shifting, but it grew more pronounced, darker, almost like a shape pressing against the glass from the other side. Mark grabbed his flashlight and the walkie-talkie, his breath shallow and rapid. He forced himself to step out of the office and into the vast, hollow mall. The air seemed colder now, each breath leaving a faint mist in front of him. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered sporadically, casting the corridor in alternating bursts of light and darkness. As he approached the fitting rooms, the tapping sound grew louder, more insistent, until it stopped altogether. He called out, his voice echoing down the corridor. "Miss, the mall is closed. Are you all right?" The silence that followed was suffocating. It was the kind of silence that seemed alive, pressing in from all sides, carrying a weight of unseen eyes. Mark reached the fitting room stall where the girl had entered. The door was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness spilling into the hallway. His flashlight beam wavered as he pushed the door open with a trembling hand. The stall was empty, but the mirror inside was fogged, as though someone had been breathing against it. And there, scrawled in the condensation, were words that chilled him to the core. "Help me before they find you." His flashlight flickered again, and for a split second, the mirror showed not his own reflection, but a dark, indistinct figure standing just behind him. Whipping around, Mark found nothing but the suffocating darkness of the empty hallway. He stumbled back, his mind racing. Something was wrong, terribly, irreversibly wrong. Whatever this was, it wasn't over. It was only beginning. Mark stood frozen in the dimly lit fitting room corridor, the chilling message still lingering in the fogged mirror. "Help me before they find you." His heart pounded in his chest like a drumbeat of impending doom. Every instinct screamed for him to leave, to abandon his shift, lock the doors, and never look back. But something held him there, tethered by an inexplicable force. Was it curiosity? Duty? Or perhaps the unshakable feeling that turning his back now might invite something even worse? He stepped out into the corridor, his flashlight casting trembling beams of light across the walls. The once familiar surroundings now felt alien, as though the mall itself were shifting, reshaping into a labyrinth of fear. Shadows stretched and twisted unnaturally, seeming to flicker at the edges of his vision. The silence was no longer merely oppressive, it was predatory, as if it were waiting for him to make the wrong move. Mark's mind raced with questions. Who was the girl? Why had she disappeared without a trace? And what did she mean by they? He tried to shake off the mounting dread, rationalizing that the message was some elaborate prank. Perhaps it was written by a bored teenager before the mirrors fogged, and the girl had simply slipped out unnoticed. But deep down he knew better. The icy air, the unnatural flicker of the lights, and the fleeting shadow in the mirror were not the work of mischievous kids. Something far darker was at play. As he weighed his options, Mark's walkie-talkie crackled to life, startling him. The sound was distorted, garbled, as though the signal were coming from deep underwater. Through the static, a voice emerged, a faint, whispering tone that sent chills down his spine. "She's not safe, and neither are you." The walkie-talkie fell silent, the dead air more terrifying than the words themselves. Mark gripped his flashlight tighter, his knuckles white. He could leave now, lock the doors, and call the authorities. But the thought of leaving the girl, if she was still here, gnawed at him. What if she needed help? What if he was her only chance? He clenched his jaw, forcing himself to push past the fear. If there was even the slightest chance she was in danger, he had to find her. He started walking, each step heavier than the last. The mall felt endless now, its layout unfamiliar despite years of working there. The stores on either side were dark and lifeless, their mannequins looming like silent sentinels. Occasionally, he thought he heard faint whispers, but when he stopped to listen, the silence swallowed them whole. Reaching the fitting rooms once more, Mark's resolve faltered. The air here was colder than anywhere else, the kind of cold that gnawed at the soul. He called out again, his voice cracking under the weight of his fear. "Miss, if you're still here, please answer me." No response. Just the eerie hum of the fluorescent lights above. His mind replayed the words on the mirror and the distorted voice on the walkie-talkie. Who were they? And why did it feel like they were closer now? Mark made his decision. He stepped into the fitting room corridor, determined to check each stall thoroughly. The first few were empty, their mirrors unremarkable. But as he approached the stall where the girl had vanished, a deep sense of foreboding washed over him. The door was ajar, just as he had left it, but the mirror inside was no longer fogged. Instead, it reflected a darkness that seemed to stretch infinitely, as if the glass were a portal to another realm. The walkie-talkie crackled again, and this time the voice was louder, more urgent. "They're coming. You need to run." The message ended abruptly, leaving Mark in deafening silence once more. He stared into the mirror, his reflection distorted and wrong. For a moment, it wasn't his face staring back but the girl's, her piercing eyes filled with terror. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. Mark staggered back, his courage wavering. The choice was clear: flee while he still could, or confront whatever darkness lay ahead. But deep down, he already knew there was no escape. The mall had him now, and the only way out was through. Mark's breath hitched as he stood before the fitting room stall. The air was ice cold, wrapping around him like an invisible vice. Every instinct screamed for him to turn and run, but his feet remained rooted to the spot, as if the darkness itself held him captive. The walkie-talkie, now silent at his side, felt heavier than ever, a grim reminder of the cryptic warning: "They're coming. You need to run." But he didn't move. He couldn't. Something beyond fear drove him forward, a desperate need to know what lurked in the shadows, what had claimed the girl, and why it now seemed to reach for him. With trembling hands, Mark pushed the fitting room door open wider. The mirror inside seemed to swallow the faint beam of his flashlight, its surface unnervingly black, as though it no longer reflected reality, but another world entirely. The longer he stared, the more his surroundings faded, leaving only the endless void of the mirror. He could almost feel it pulling at him, like a current in deep, uncharted waters. Then a flicker, a faint, fleeting image. The girl was there, her face pale and twisted in anguish. She wasn't looking at him, but at something beyond the edges of the mirror, something Mark couldn't see. Her lips moved silently, mouthing words he couldn't understand. He stepped closer, his eyes locked on her desperate expression, when suddenly, her head snapped toward him. Her eyes, wide and filled with terror, seemed to plead with him. And then he heard it, a whisper, faint but chilling, echoing through the air around him. "Get out." Mark stumbled back, his flashlight slipping from his grasp and clattering to the floor. Darkness swallowed the corridor, but in that black void, a sound emerged, low, guttural, and inhuman. It was a growl deep and resonant, vibrating through the very walls of the mall. The sound grew louder, accompanied by faint scratching, as though claws were dragging across metal. The fitting room mirrors began to rattle violently, their glass threatening to shatter under the force of something unseen. Desperation clawed at Mark's mind as he fumbled for his flashlight. When he finally managed to switch it on, the beam landed on the mirror. The girl was gone, replaced by a black void, but something else was there now. A shadowy figure began to emerge, its form shifting and unnatural, as though it were made of smoke and malice. It stepped closer to the surface of the glass, its jagged silhouette bending and contorting in impossible ways. The growling ceased, replaced by a deafening silence. The shadow leaned closer, its head tilting as if to study him. And then it spoke, its voice a low, guttural rasp that seemed to scrape against Mark's very soul. "She belongs to us." "Now, so do you." Mark staggered backward, his heart pounding as the mirror began to crack. The fractures spread like lightning across its surface, emitting a high-pitched whine that pierced the silence. Then, without warning, the glass shattered, sending shards flying through the air. But instead of falling to the ground, the shards hovered, suspended in midair, each one reflecting the shadowy figure from a different angle. Mark turned to run, but the corridor had changed. The once familiar fitting rooms now stretched endlessly in both directions, the walls warped and shifting like the inside of a living organism. The mannequins that had stood silently in nearby displays were now scattered across the floor, their limbs twisted and contorted. Some were missing heads, while others had faces that seemed to stare at him with lifeless, hollow eyes. The growling returned, louder and closer this time. Mark's flashlight flickered, its beam barely cutting through the oppressive darkness. He turned back toward the shattered mirror, and his blood ran cold. The shadowy figure had stepped through, no longer confined to the glass. It towered over him, its form massive and shifting, its eyes glowing faintly with an unnatural light. It reached for him, its elongated fingers stretching impossibly far. Mark's body refused to move, paralyzed by fear as the figure loomed closer. Just as its hand was about to touch him, the walkie-talkie at his side crackled to life once more. A voice, distant but urgent, pierced the chaos. "Run. Don't let it touch you." Summoning every ounce of strength, Mark broke free from his paralysis and sprinted down the warped corridor. The sound of the creature's pursuit was deafening. Footsteps that seemed to shake the very foundation of the mall, accompanied by the relentless growling and the scraping of claws against tile. He ran blindly, the corridors twisting and looping in impossible ways. The mall was no longer the place he had known. It was a maze, a trap designed to keep him within its clutches. Every turn seemed to lead him back to the fitting rooms, where the shattered mirror remained, its shards still hovering like frozen fragments of a nightmare. Mark's lungs burned, his legs threatening to give out, but he couldn't stop. He didn't dare look back. Whatever had come through that mirror wasn't just chasing him, it was hunting him, and it wouldn't stop until it claimed him as its own. Mark's sprint slowed as the endless, twisting corridors of the mall seemed to fold in on themselves. The air was suffocating, heavy with the scent of burnt metal and something faintly sweet, like decaying flowers. His flashlight was now a mere flicker, barely illuminating the distorted walls and looming shadows around him. His heart pounded violently, every beat echoing in his ears, as if the mall itself were amplifying his terror. The creature's footsteps reverberated through the floor, each one closer, heavier, and more menacing. In his desperation, Mark stumbled into what should have been a maintenance room. But as he pushed open the door, he realized this space wasn't on any mall blueprint. The room was vast and impossibly dark, its only light coming from the faint, ghostly glow of an enormous mirror dominating the far wall. Unlike the mirrors in the fitting rooms, this one was pristine, its surface smooth and inviting, as though it beckoned him to step closer. The shards from the earlier fitting room encounter hovered here as well, suspended around the frame, each reflecting fractured versions of himself, terrified, desperate, and defeated. As he approached the mirror, his reflection moved out of sync, lagging behind as though trapped in its own timeline. Mark froze. His reflection smiled, an unnatural, chilling grin that didn't belong to him. Then it spoke, its voice dripping with malice. "You weren't supposed to see. Now you're part of it." The lights in the room flickered violently, and for a brief moment, Mark glimpsed a scene within the mirror, a twisted, grotesque version of the mall. The corridors were lined with shadowy figures, their hollow eyes glowing faintly, their bodies writhing as though barely tethered to this reality. At the center of the vision stood the girl, her crimson blouse now stained with what looked like blood. She reached out toward him, her expression a mixture of terror and pleading, as if trapped in a nightmare she couldn't escape. The voice of the creature boomed behind him, low and guttural. She opened the door. "Now you will keep it closed." Mark turned sharply, his flashlight illuminating the hulking form of the shadowy figure from earlier. It loomed impossibly tall, its limbs stretching and bending at unnatural angles. Its face, or where a face should have been, was a void, a swirling mass of darkness that seemed to consume the light around it. Mark stumbled back, his body trembling as the creature extended one of its grotesque hands toward the mirror. The girl inside screamed, her voice muffled and distorted, as the creature's fingers began to press against the glass. The surface rippled like water, and cracks began to form, spiderwebbing outward with each passing second. Desperation surged within Mark. He didn't know why, but he felt certain that if the mirror shattered completely, it would release something far worse than the creature before him. His mind raced for a solution, but nothing made sense. Then, his gaze landed on the shards floating in the air. Each one reflected the creature's form in fractured, distorted fragments. Without thinking, he lunged for one of the shards, the sharp edge slicing into his hand as he gripped it. Pain shot through him, but he barely noticed. Turning toward the creature, he thrust the shard forward, aiming for the swirling void where its face should have been. The creature let out a deafening, otherworldly shriek, its body convulsing violently as the shard made contact. Mark was thrown backward by an unseen force, his body slamming against the cold, hard floor. When he opened his eyes, the creature was gone, but the mirror wasn't. The surface of the glass now shimmered, no longer reflecting the twisted mall but a familiar scene. The fitting rooms, quiet and empty, as they had been before the nightmare began. Mark staggered to his feet, his body aching and his mind reeling. He approached the mirror cautiously, his reflection now matching his movements. But as he drew closer, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Behind his reflection, faint but unmistakable, was the girl. Her lips moved silently, mouthing words he couldn't hear. But as she raised her hand to the glass, her message became clear. Written in condensation on the inside of the mirror were the words, "It's not over." The lights in the room flickered once more, and when they steadied, the mirror shattered into 1,000 pieces, each shard clattering to the floor in deafening silence. Mark was left standing in the maintenance room, his own reflection now gone, replaced by darkness. His walkie-talkie crackled to life one last time, the distorted voice faint but unmistakable. "You've taken her place. They're watching." The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. The girl had been trapped, and now he was. The mall's malevolence had chosen him, binding him to its endless cycle of terror. As he stumbled out of the room, the corridors of the mall stretched out before him once more, warped and infinite. He wasn't free. He never would be. And somewhere in the shadows, they were waiting. Mark staggered out of the strange room, his vision swimming as the corridors of the mall stretched endlessly before him. The familiar layout he'd walked countless times now seemed alien, distorted by some unseen force. Each step echoed unnaturally, the sound ricocheting as though the walls themselves were alive, mocking him with his own fear. The oppressive darkness clung to him, wrapping around his body like a suffocating shroud. The air was heavy, tasting faintly of decay and something metallic, as if the very essence of the mall had turned toxic. His flashlight flickered weakly, casting just enough light to illuminate the next few feet ahead. Shadows darted at the edges of his vision, quick, silent, and impossible to pin down. It felt as though the walls themselves were breathing, expanding and contracting with each strained step he took. Panic bubbled in his chest, but Mark forced himself to keep moving. He needed to find an exit, to escape the nightmare that now gripped them all. But the exits were gone. The familiar glowing signs that should have marked the way out were nowhere to be seen. Instead, the corridors looped endlessly, leading him back to the same fitting room hallway again and again. The fitting rooms themselves now seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, their mirrors cracked, but still reflecting a world that was not his own. Mark's walkie-talkie crackled to life, breaking the suffocating silence. The voice was no longer distorted, but it wasn't a comforting sound. It was the girl's voice, soft, trembling, yet filled with urgency. "You need to stop running," she said. "It's too late for that. They won't let you leave." The words sent a chill down his spine. He turned, expecting to see her, but the hallway behind him was empty, save for the flickering shadows that seemed to move closer with every passing second. "What do you mean?" Mark shouted, his voice echoing unnaturally. "What's happening? Who are they?" The voice answered, quieter this time, as though the girl were fading. "They don't want you to leave. They need someone to stay." The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. He wasn't escaping, not tonight, not ever. The mall wasn't just a building, it was something alive, something ancient, and it required a sacrifice. The girl had been its prisoner, and now it had chosen him to take her place. Mark's knees buckled, and he collapsed onto the cold, tiled floor. The shadows closed in around him, their shapes becoming more defined. They weren't just abstract forms anymore. They were figures, humanoid but wrong. Their limbs were too long, their movements too jerky, like broken puppets manipulated by unseen strings. Their hollow, glowing eyes stared directly at him, unblinking as they crept closer. Desperation surged through him. He scrambled to his feet and ran, his breath ragged, his legs burning with exhaustion. But no matter how far he ran, the mall wouldn't let him go. The corridors stretched endlessly, bending and twisting, leading him back to where he had started. The fitting rooms, the shattered mirrors, the lingering chill. It was all a trap, a maze designed to break him. Finally, Mark collapsed against a wall, his body trembling with fear and exhaustion. The shadows surrounded him now, their cold, unnatural presence pressing in on all sides. He screamed, a raw, primal sound that echoed through the empty mall. But the shadows didn't flinch. Instead, they stopped, watching silently as the air grew colder and the lights began to dim. In the final moments, Mark felt an overwhelming sense of resignation. There was no escape. The mall had claimed him, just as it had claimed the girl before him. The last thing he saw before the darkness consumed him was his reflection in one of the remaining shards of mirror. But it wasn't his reflection, it was hers. The girl stared back at him, her eyes filled with sorrow and a faint, haunting smile. The shard shattered, and with it, Mark's world dissolved into blackness. When the mall opened the next morning, it was as if nothing had happened. The fitting rooms were pristine, the mirrors replaced, and the corridors filled with the usual bustle of shoppers. But for those who paid close attention, a new shadow lingered in the reflections of the mirrors, faint but unmistakable. And in the quietest corners of the mall, where the air grew unnaturally cold, some swore they could hear the faint echo of a man's voice, calling out, trapped forever in the endless maze. The mall's whispers continued. The stories passed among employees and customers alike. But now they carried a new warning: don't stay too late. The mall doesn't like to be empty. The mall's usual hum of activity resumed the next day, as if the horrors of the previous night had never occurred. Shoppers meandered through the brightly lit aisles, oblivious to the lingering unease that hung in the air. Employees joked about closing shifts and the so-called haunted fitting rooms, but their laughter faltered when passing certain areas, places where the air felt heavier, colder, or unnervingly silent. Mark was never seen again. His absence was dismissed as an abrupt resignation, a story swept under the rug by mall management. But for those who worked late shifts, his name became something of a whispered legend. Security guards, cleaning staff, and even store clerks began to report strange occurrences. Items misplaced, mirrors cracking without explanation, and faint, distorted voices calling their names when no one else was around. Weeks later, a new security guard was assigned to the night shift. On his first evening, he found an old flashlight abandoned in the fitting room corridor, its battery drained but the casing ice-cold to the touch. That night, as he patrolled the mall, he noticed something peculiar about the mirrors. His own reflection appeared wrong, slightly delayed, as if the glass held a version of him that lagged behind reality. When he leaned closer, he thought he saw someone standing just behind him, a man, his face pale, his eyes wide with terror. The figure vanished before he could turn around. Shoppers, too, began to notice oddities. Children pointed at mirrors and whispered about the man in the shadows who smiled when no one else did. Store mannequins, once innocuous, seemed to shift positions overnight, their blank faces angled slightly toward the fitting rooms. Some customers reported feeling watched, an oppressive gaze that followed them from certain corners of the mall. One woman swore she heard faint footsteps echoing behind her, even though she was completely alone. But the most unsettling reports came from those brave enough, or foolish enough, to stay late. They described seeing a girl in a crimson blouse wandering near the fitting rooms. She never spoke, her movements slow and deliberate, but her face was unforgettable. Her hollow eyes, wide with fear, seemed to plead for help. Yet whenever someone approached her, she would vanish, leaving only the faintest chill in the air. One night, a janitor working overtime found a message scrawled in condensation on a mirror in the fitting room corridor. "It's not over." He quit the next day, refusing to return even to collect his final paycheck. The stories grew, whispered from employee to employee, until they became a part of the mall's identity, a sinister undercurrent beneath its polished exterior. Management ignored the rumors, chalking them up to overactive imaginations, but the nighttime staff knew better. They spoke in hushed tones of the mall's hunger, its need to trap and consume, to replace one lost soul with another. And then there was the fitting room itself. Despite management's efforts to maintain it, strange things continued to happen there. The mirrors refused to stay intact, cracking under no apparent stress. One by one, the stalls were closed, deemed out of service, until the entire fitting room area was sealed off. A heavy padlock now secured the doors, but late-night employees swore they could still hear faint tapping sounds from within, as if someone, or something, was trying to get out. For Mark, the nightmare didn't end. Trapped in the mirror's twisted reality, he wandered the distorted halls of the mall's reflection, its grotesque facsimile of the world he once knew. The corridors stretched infinitely, looping back on themselves, and the faint echoes of shoppers and employees became his only company. He screamed for help, but no one heard him. Except for her. The girl in the crimson blouse appeared often, her figure pale and flickering like a dying light. She didn't speak, but watched him with those same pleading eyes. Over time, Mark realized the truth. She wasn't just another victim, she was part of the mall now, tethered to its malevolence like he was. And just as the mall had claimed her, it had claimed him. Mark's sense of time dissolved in the mirror world. Days and nights blended into an endless gray void. But one thing remained constant, the shadows. They followed him, stalking just out of sight, whispering promises of release and threats of eternal torment. They never got close enough to touch him, but never left him alone. In his rare moments of clarity, Mark thought of the outside world, of the people who might one day take his place. He wondered if they would notice the signs, the cold spots, the strange reflections, the whispers in the dark. But deep down, he knew the truth. The mall would always find someone new. Back in the real world, the mall thrived, its corridors filled with life and noise. But late at night, when the crowds disappeared, the atmosphere changed. The mirrors grew darker, the fitting rooms colder, and the shadows longer. Employees who dared to work the closing shift would sometimes catch glimpses of Mark in the reflections, his face a silent warning to those who stayed too late. The mall remains open to this day, its polished floors and bright lights hiding the darkness beneath. But for those who know the stories, one rule stands above all else: never stay past closing. The mall doesn't like to be empty.